My name is Eleanor, and 6 months ago I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile beep of machines louder than the silence where my family's voices should have been. The stitches across my chest tugged with every breath, a raw scar from the surgery that carved out the cancer but left a deeper wound no surgeon could mend. I was 68 years old, a widow for a decade, and I'd spent my life pouring my heart into the people who now couldn't be troubled to sit by my side. I stared at the ceiling, counting the tiles until my eyes blurred, waiting for a nurse to check my chart or for footsteps that never came. My son David didn't visit. My daughter-in-law Claire didn't call. The only trace of them was a text from David sent the night before my surgery. "Mom will handle things at home. Just focus on getting better." It read like kindness, but I knew better. I'd seen their glances, the way their eyes slid past me, like I was already fading into the wallpaper of my own life. I'd raised David alone after my husband Tom passed. David was 17 then, a boy raging against a world that took his father too soon. I was the one who held him through his tears, worked 2 jobs to keep our small house, and stood in the rain at his soccer games, cheering even when he didn't look my way. That house, a modest 2-story with a creaking porch and a garden I'd coaxed into bloom for decades, was my sanctuary. Tom and I bought it with every penny we'd saved, each brick a vow we made to each other. I never dreamed it would become a battleground. When David married Claire 5 years ago, I opened my heart to her. She was sharp-driven, and I thought she'd be the daughter I never had. I welcomed her into our home, cooked her favorite pot roast, and smiled when she teased me about my outdated dresses. But slowly, the warmth faded. Claire's smiles grew brittle, her words sharp. She'd sigh when I offered advice, dismiss my stories as old news, and once when she thought I was out of earshot, I heard her murmur to David, "She's dragging us down. This house could be so much more without her." I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the stress of their new coffee shop, a venture they'd started with a loan I co-signed. I dipped into my savings to help them, believing it was what a mother did. But the more I gave, the less they saw me. By the time I felt the lump in my breast, I was already a shadow in their lives. I kept it to myself at first. I went to the doctor alone, sat through the biopsy alone, and when the word cancer fell from the doctor's mouth, I nodded like it was just another task on my list. I thought telling David might wake him up, remind him I was his mother. I called him that night, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. "David," I said, "I need to talk to you. It's important." His voice was distant, like he was scrolling through his phone. "Mom, can it wait?" Claire slammed at the shop. I swallowed hard and said, "It's cancer, David. I'm having surgery next week." There was a pause too long, and then he said, "God, Mom, that's terrible. We'll figure something out, okay? I've got to go." The line went dead, and I sat there, the phone still warm in my hand, feeling like I'd lost something I couldn't name. The day of the surgery, I packed a small bag and took a cab to the hospital. I didn't ask them to come. I told myself it was dignity, but it was fear they'd say no. The nurse, a young woman with gentle eyes, asked if anyone was coming to pick me up after. I lied and said yes. When I woke up groggy and aching, the room was empty. I stayed 3 days, each one stretching longer than the last, and no one came. On the 4th day, I took another cab home, my body weak, but my mind sharp with a pain that wasn't physical. When I walked through the front door, Claire was in the living room moving furniture like she was erasing me. She looked startled, like I'd caught her doing something wrong. "Eleanor," she said, "not even Mom. You're back already." David came down the stairs, his face tight. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and my stomach twisted. I knew that tone. It was the same one he used as a teenager when he'd broken something and wanted me to fix it. We sat at the kitchen table, the one where I'd taught him to read, where we'd laughed over lumpy pancakes. Claire folded her arms, her polished nails tapping the wood. David wouldn't look at me. "Mom," he said, "this isn't working. You living here, it's too much." The business is struggling and we need space to grow. Claire and I think it's best if you find somewhere else." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing my breath. "Somewhere else," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Claire leaned forward, her tone smooth as ice. "There are lovely senior apartments nearby, Eleanor. You'd be comfortable and we'd visit all the time." Senior apartments. The phrase stung like a slap. This was my home, the one I'd paid for, the one I'd kept standing through every storm, and they wanted me gone. I looked at David, searching for the boy who used to run to me when he was scared. "David," I said, "this is my house. Your father and I built this life for you." His jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw something hard in his eyes, something that wasn't my son. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're a family now, and we need to do what's best for us. Us, not me, not his mother who'd given him everything." I stood, my legs shaking, and walked to my room. I didn't cry, not then. I packed a suitcase, took my jewelry box, and called a cab. As I left, Claire called out, "We'll check on you soon, Eleanor." But I didn't turn back. I couldn't trust my voice to answer. The cab took me to a motel on the edge of town, a place with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed like a trapped insect. I checked in, sat on the lumpy bed, and stared at the water-stained wall. My chest ached, not from the surgery, but from the weight of being unwanted. I was 68 years old, and my own son had cast me out. I thought of Tom, how he'd always said I was the strongest woman he knew. I didn't feel strong. I felt like a fool, a woman who'd loved too fiercely and trusted too blindly. That night, I opened my jewelry box and took out my wedding ring, the plain gold band Tom had given me 45 years ago. I held it to the light, watching it glint in the dim glow of the motel lamp. "What do I do now, Tom?" I whispered. There was no answer, but the ring felt solid in my hand, like a vow that hadn't broken. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain drumming on the motel roof. My body was sore, my mind heavy, but something stirred inside me, a spark of the woman I used to be. I couldn't stay in that motel forever. I had money, not much, but enough from my savings and Tom's life insurance. I had my pride bruised but not shattered, and I had a secret they didn't know: the house they were living in. The business they were running, it was all in my name. Tom and I had never transferred the deed to David, and the loan for the coffee shop, I'd co-signed it, tying my credit to their ambitions. They thought they could erase me, but they didn't know the power I still held. I slipped the ring onto my finger, feeling its familiar weight, and made a choice. I wasn't going to beg for their love. I was going to rebuild my life step by step, and when the time came, they'd see who I really was. But that first day, I didn't know where to start. I sat in the motel room, the rain still falling, and felt the loneliness settle into my bones. I thought of my garden, the roses I'd tended for years, and wondered if Claire would let them die. I thought of David, how he used to draw pictures for me, how he'd once said I was his hero. Where had that boy gone? I opened my suitcase and pulled out a photo of Tom and me, taken on our 25th anniversary. We were laughing, his arm around me, the sun setting behind us. I traced his face with my finger, and for the first time since the hospital, I let myself cry. Not loud, not sobbing, but quiet tears that burned as they fell. I cried for Tom, for David, for the life I thought I'd built. But mostly, I cried for me, for the woman who'd given everything and been left with nothing. When the tears stopped, I wiped my face and looked at the photo again. Tom's smile seemed to say, "You're still here, Ellie. You're still you." I didn't know what came next, but I knew I couldn't stay in that motel hiding from the world. I picked up the phone and called the only person I could think of, Margaret, my oldest friend who'd known me since we were girls. Her voice was warm like a fire on a cold night. "Eleanor," she said, "where are you? I've been worried sick." I told her everything, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. When I finished, she didn't hesitate. "You're coming to my place," she said. No arguments. I wanted to protest to say I didn't want to be a burden, but her voice was firm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt seen. I checked out of the motel that afternoon and took a cab to Margaret's house, a small bungalow filled with books and the smell of lavender. She hugged me so tightly, I thought my stitches might burst, but I didn't care. For the first time since the hospital, I wasn't alone. That night, over cups of tea, I told her about the house, the business, the truth David and Claire didn't know. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "They think they can push you out," she said, "but they don't know who they're dealing with. You're Eleanor Marie Thompson, and you don't break." Her words lit something in me, an ember of defiance I thought had gone cold. I didn't know how, but I was going to fight, not with shouting or tears, but with the quiet strength Tom always saw in me. I looked at my ring glinting in the lamplight and felt the first stirrings of a plan. Margaret's house was a haven, a small bungalow tucked behind a row of oak trees, its walls lined with books and photographs that told the story of a life well lived. That first night, as we sat at her kitchen table, the steam from our tea curling into the air, I felt the weight of the past weeks settle into my bones. My body was still sore from the surgery, my chest a map of stitches and scars, but the pain in my heart was heavier. I told Margaret everything: David's cold words, Claire's calculated dismissal, the way they'd pushed me out of my own home, like I was a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. Margaret listened, her eyes sharp and kind, her hands folded around her mug. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Eleanor," she said, her voice steady, "you've been through hell, but you're still here. And that's more than they can say." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of despair. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds outside Margaret's window. My suitcase sat in the corner of the guest room, a reminder of how little I'd taken with me. My jewelry box was on the nightstand, and I reached for it, opening the lid to touch the gold band of my wedding ring, Tom's ring. I slipped it onto my finger, feeling its familiar weight, and whispered, "I'm still here, Tom. I'm trying." I didn't know what came next, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. Margaret was already in the kitchen flipping pancakes, her gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. "You're up," she said, sliding a plate in front of me. "Eat. We've got work to do." I raised an eyebrow and she grinned. "You didn't think I'd let you mope, did you? We're gonna figure this out, you and me." Over breakfast, I told her the truth. I'd only hinted at the night before. The house David and Claire were living in, the coffee shop they were running, it was all in my name. Tom and I had bought the house outright, never transferring the deed to David. The loan for the coffee shop, I'd co-signed it, tying my credit to their dreams. I'd done it out of love, but now it was a power they didn't know I held. Margaret's eyes gleamed. "They think they've won," she said, "but they've underestimated you. We need a plan, Eleanor. Not revenge, justice." The word felt heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Justice. I wasn't sure what it looked like, but the idea of it stirred something in me, a spark of the woman I used to be. The first days at Margaret's were quiet, almost too quiet. My body was healing, but my mind was a storm. I'd wake in the night replaying David's words, "We need to do what's best for us." I'd see Claire's face, her cool smile as she suggested senior apartments, as if I were a problem to be solved. I'd think of my garden, the roses I'd planted with Tom, and wonder if they were wilting under Claire's neglect. But in the daylight, Margaret kept me moving. She'd drag me to her garden, hand me a trowel, and say, "Dig." It's good for the soul. I'd kneel in the dirt, my hands trembling at first, and lose myself in the rhythm of planting bulbs and pulling weeds. It wasn't my garden, but it was something, a small act of creation that reminded me I could still make things grow. One afternoon, as we sat on her porch with glasses of iced tea, Margaret handed me a notebook. "Write it down," she said. everything you're feeling, everything they've done. You don't have to show anyone, but you need to get it out. I hesitated, my pen hovering over the page. I hadn't written anything since Tom died, not even a grocery list. But as I started, the words came like a flood. I wrote about the hospital, the loneliness, the way David's voice had sounded when he told me to leave. I wrote about Claire's eyes, how they'd once been warm but now looked through me. I wrote about Tom, how he'd believed in me, how I'd lost myself trying to be the mother David needed. By the time I stopped, the pages were damp with tears I hadn't realized I'd shed. Margaret didn't say anything, just put her hand on my shoulder. It was enough. That notebook became my companion. I wrote in it every night, spilling my grief and anger onto the pages. But slowly, something else crept in, memories of who I'd been before. The Eleanor who'd laughed with Tom until her sides ached, who danced in the kitchen to old records, who'd built a life from nothing. I started writing about her too, and with every word I felt a piece of myself come back. One evening as I closed the notebook, I looked at Margaret and said, "I don't want to just survive this. I want to live again." She smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "That's my girl," she said. "Now let's make it happen." The next step was practical, and it scared me more than I wanted to admit. Margaret drove me to the bank where I checked my accounts. My savings were smaller than I'd hoped, drained by the help I'd given David and Claire, but Tom's life insurance was still there, a modest sum I'd never touched. I sat with the banker, a young man who called me ma'am too many times, and asked about my options. He suggested investments, but I wasn't ready for that. I needed something solid, something I could control. I asked about the house, the loan, the business. His eyes widened when he pulled up the records. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "you're the primary owner of the property, and the loan is tied to your credit. If they default, it's on you." I nodded, my heart pounding. They hadn't defaulted yet, but the knowledge that I held the reins gave me a strange kind of strength. That night, I sat with Margaret and told her what I'd learned. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrow. "You've got leverage, Eleanor," she said, "but you need to be smart. They don't know you're the one keeping their world together. Let's keep it that way for now." She suggested I see a lawyer, someone who could help me protect what was mine. The idea made my stomach churn. A lawyer meant confrontation, maybe even a fight. I'd spent my life avoiding conflict, smoothing things over for David, for Tom, for everyone. But Margaret was right. This wasn't about anger. It was about survival. I called a lawyer the next day, a woman named Susan, who'd been recommended by Margaret's neighbor. Susan's office was small, cluttered with files, but her handshake was firm. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. She listened, taking notes, and when I finished, she looked at me with something like respect. "Eleanor," she said, "you've got options. Let's start with the house." Susan explained that I could demand David and Claire leave, but it would be messy, expensive, and public. Instead, she suggested something quieter, a new will. I hadn't updated mine since Tom died, and it still left everything to David. "You need to decide what you want," Susan said. "Not just for now, but for the future." The idea of rewriting my will felt final, like closing a door I'd kept open for David. But as I thought about his words, his betrayal, I knew it was time. I told Susan I wanted to protect my assets, to make sure they went to people who valued me. She nodded and said, "We'll start with a draft. You don't have to decide everything today." That night, I sat in Margaret's guest room, the notebook open in my lap. I wrote about the will, about what it meant to cut David out, not completely, not yet, but enough to protect myself. It hurt like carving out a piece of my heart, but it also felt right. I thought of my garden, how you sometimes have to prune a rose to help it bloom. Maybe this was my pruning, my way of cutting away what was killing me. I wrote until my hand cramped, then closed the notebook and looked at my ring. "I'm doing this for me, Tom," I said. "For us." The next morning, I went to the library, a place I hadn't visited in years. I wanted to research, to understand my rights, to arm myself with knowledge. The librarian, a woman about my age, with a warm smile, helped me find books on property law and estate planning. I spent hours there reading, taking notes, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just Eleanor, the discarded mother. I was Eleanor, the woman who'd survived loss and betrayal and was still standing. When I left the library, I passed a small boutique with a dress in the window, a deep blue, simple but elegant. On impulse, I went inside and tried it on. The mirror showed a woman I hadn't seen in years, one with gray hair and tired eyes, but a spark of something fierce. I bought the dress, and when I showed it to Margaret, she clapped her hands. "That's the Eleanor I know," she said. "Now let's keep going." The days turned into weeks, and with each one, I felt stronger. I met with Susan again, refining the will. I started walking every morning, my body slowly healing. I helped Margaret in her garden, planting tulips that would bloom in the spring. And I wrote, filling the notebook with my fears, my hopes, my plans. I didn't know when or how I'd face David and Claire, but I knew I would. Not with shouting or tears, but with the quiet strength Tom had always seen in me. One evening, as I sat on Margaret's porch watching the sunset, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And that was the most powerful rebellion of all. The weeks at Margaret's house began to blur into a rhythm I hadn't known I needed. Mornings started with coffee and the soft chatter of birds outside her window, their songs a reminder that the world kept turning even when my heart felt stuck. My body was healing the stitches across my chest, fading into a thin, pale line. But the deeper ache, the one left by David's betrayal. Claire's coldness lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Yet in Margaret's small bungalow, surrounded by her books and her unwavering belief in me, I began to find pieces of myself I'd thought were lost forever. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in years, I was learning to live for me. Margaret was relentless in her quiet way. She'd nudge me out of bed on days when the weight of everything felt too heavy, hand me a trowel for her garden, or set a plate of her famous blueberry muffins in front of me with a look that said, "You're not giving up." Her garden became my refuge. I'd spend hours kneeling in the dirt, my hands buried in the cool earth, planting bulbs or trimming back overgrown vines. It wasn't my garden, not the one I'd tended for decades with Tom, but it was something alive, something I could nurture. Each tulip bulb I pressed into the soil felt like a promise to myself, a vow that I could still create, still grow, even after everything had been taken. My notebook, the one Margaret had given me, was filling up. I wrote every night sometimes until my hand ached, pouring out the memories that haunted me. I wrote about the hospital, the sterile silence of waking up alone. I wrote about David's voice, how it had sounded so much like a stranger's when he told me to leave. I wrote about Claire, her polished nails and her calculated words, the way she'd called me Eleanor, like I was a tenant instead of family. But I also wrote about the woman I used to be, the Eleanor who'd laughed with Tom in our kitchen, who danced barefoot to Ella Fitzgerald, who'd built a home from nothing but love and stubbornness. With every page, I felt her stirring like a seed, breaking through the earth after a long winter. One morning, as I sat at Margaret's kitchen table, sipping tea and staring at my notebook, she slid a newspaper across to me. "Look at this," she said, tapping an article about a local women's group that met at the community center. "They do workshops, book clubs, even legal clinics. You should go." I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my mug. The idea of walking into a room full of strangers made my stomach twist. I'd spent so long being David's mother, Tom's wife, that I wasn't sure who I was without them. But Margaret's eyes were steady, and I knew she wouldn't let me hide. "I'll think about it," I said, and she smirked like she knew I'd already decided. That afternoon, I put on the blue dress I'd bought from the boutique, the one that made me feel like a version of myself I was still getting to know. I brushed my gray hair, pinned it back, and slipped Tom's ring onto my finger. The community center was a short walk from Margaret's, and as I stepped inside, the hum of voices and the smell of coffee greeted me. The women's group was small, maybe a dozen women, most of them my age or older, their faces lined with stories I could only guess at. The leader, a woman named Ruth, with a warm smile and a no-nonsense voice, welcomed me like I'd been there for years. "We're talking about resilience today," she said. "What it means to keep going when life knocks you down." I sat quietly at first listening as the others shared their stories: divorces, lost children, illnesses, dreams deferred. Their voices wove a tapestry of pain and strength, and I realized I wasn't alone. When it was my turn, I froze. My throat tightened, and I thought of David, of the house of the hospital bed. But Ruth's eyes were kind, and I heard myself speak. "My name is Eleanor," I said, my voice shaky. "I had cancer surgery a few months ago, and my son, he told me to leave our home. It was my home, the one I built with my husband, and he said it wasn't mine anymore." The words spilled out raw and unpolished, and when I stopped, the room was quiet. Then Ruth reached over and touched my hand. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Another woman, Helen, handed me a tissue, her own eyes wet. "My daughter did something similar," she said. "It breaks your heart, but it doesn't break you." For the first time, I believed that might be true. I started going to the group every week. The women became my anchor, their stories a mirror to my own. Helen, who'd lost her home to her daughter's manipulations, taught me how to laugh again, her dry humor cutting through the pain. Ruth shared articles on estate planning, quietly slipping them into my hand like contraband. And Sarah, a retired teacher with a soft voice, invited me to her book club, where we read novels about women who rebuilt their lives after betrayal. Each meeting chipped away at the loneliness I'd carried since the hospital, replacing it with a fragile but growing sense of belonging. Meanwhile, my meetings with Susan the lawyer were moving forward. She drafted a new will, one that protected my assets and gave me control over my future. I hadn't cut David out completely. I couldn't, not yet. But I'd added provisions for Margaret for the women's group for a local charity that helped cancer patients. Susan also suggested I look into the coffee shop's finances. "You co-sign the loan," she said. "You have a right to know what's happening." She helped me request records from the bank, and what I found made my blood run cold. David and Claire had missed 2 payments, and the shop was bleeding money. My credit, my name was on the line. I sat with Susan, my hands trembling, and asked what I could do. "You could call in the loan," she said, "or you could wait and let them dig their own hole. But either way, you need to protect yourself." I nodded, my mind racing. I wasn't ready to confront them, not yet. But I was starting to see a path forward, one paved with quiet, deliberate steps. Back at Margaret's, I threw myself into small acts of reclaiming my life. I started cooking again simple recipes, at first Tom's favorite meatloaf, a peach cobbler like my mother used to make. Margaret would taste them and declare me a genius, even when the crust was too crumbly. I bought a new pair of shoes, sturdy ones for walking, and began exploring the neighborhood, noticing things I'd missed before, the way the light hit the oak trees, the sound of children playing in the park. One day, I found a small antique shop and wandered inside, drawn to a silver locket on display. It was simple, heart-shaped, with a tiny clasp. I bought it on impulse, thinking of the photo of Tom and me I'd kept in my suitcase. When I got back to Margaret's, I slipped the photo into the locket and wore it around my neck, close to my heart. It wasn't just Tom I was carrying. It was the woman I'd been with him, the one I was trying to find again. One evening, as I sat on Margaret's porch, the notebook open in my lap, I heard from David for the first time since I'd left. My phone buzzed, and his name on the screen made my heart lurch. I hesitated, then answered. "Mom," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk about the house. Claire and I are thinking of selling it." We'd split the money, of course. I felt a cold anger rise in me, but I kept my voice steady. "David," I said, "that house is in my name. You can't sell it." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, he sounded irritated. Mom, don't be difficult. We're trying to do what's best for everyone. I closed my eyes, picturing the boy who used to draw pictures for me, and said, "We'll talk about it later." I hung up before he could argue, my hands shaking. Margaret, who'd overheard, looked at me with pride. "That's my girl," she said. "You're not their doormat anymore." That call lit a fire in me. I went back to the library, diving deeper into property law, learning about my rights as the homeowner. I met with Susan again and we discussed my options: eviction, a sale on my terms, or something else entirely. You could lease the house to them. She said make them pay rent. It would remind them who's in charge. The idea felt bold, almost cruel, but it also felt right. I wasn't ready to decide, but I was starting to see the power I held, not just over the house, but over my own story. I wrote about it that night, filling pages with my anger, my fear, my determination. I wrote about the locket, the women's group, the tulips in Margaret's garden. I wrote about Tom, how he'd always believed I was stronger than I knew. And for the first time, I believed it too. One Sunday, I went to church with Margaret, something I hadn't done since Tom died. The hymns washed over me, and as I sat in the pew, I felt a quiet peace. I wasn't sure if I was praying to God or to Tom or to myself, but I asked for strength, for clarity, for the courage to keep going. When we left, Margaret linked her arm through mine and said, "You're blooming, Eleanor, just like those tulips." I smiled, feeling the locket against my chest, the ring on my finger. I wasn't whole yet, but I was growing one small act at a time. And when the time came to face David and Claire, I'd be ready not with vengeance, but with the dignity they'd tried to strip away. The air was crisp the morning I woke up in Margaret's guest room, the kind of autumn chill that seeps into your bones and makes you crave a warm blanket. I pulled the quilt tighter around me, my eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling. It had been 3 months since I'd left my house, 3 months since David and Claire had pushed me out, and though I was finding my footing, the ache of their betrayal still lingered sharp as the scar across my chest. I was 68 years old, and every day felt like a choice to sink under the weight of what they'd done, or to keep reaching for the woman I used to be. That morning I chose to reach. I slipped Tom's ring onto my finger, the gold warm from my hand, and touched the locket around my neck, where his photo rested against my heart. Margaret was already in the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon rolls filling the house. She glanced at me as I shuffled in, her eyes sharp but kind. "You look like you're plotting something," she said, sliding a plate toward me. I managed a small smile. "Maybe I am," I said, and she grinned like she'd been waiting for this moment. Over breakfast, I told her about my last meeting with Susan the lawyer and the new will we were drafting. I'd been hesitant at first, afraid of what it meant to rewrite my future without David at its center. But now it felt like a lifeline, a way to take back control. "Susan thinks I should lease the house to them." I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Make them pay rent, remind them it's mine." Margaret's eyebrows shot up and she let out a low whistle. "That's bold, Eleanor. I like it." She leaned forward, her mug cradled in her hands. "But you need to be ready for their reaction. They won't take kindly to being reminded who's in charge." I nodded, my stomach twisting. I wasn't ready for a fight, not yet, but the idea of standing my ground, even quietly, lit something in me. I thought of my garden, the roses I'd nurtured for decades, and wondered if they were still blooming or if Claire had let them die. The thought spurred me on. I wasn't just fighting for a house, I was fighting for everything I'd built, everything I was. That afternoon, I went back to the women's group at the community center. The room was warm, filled with the soft hum of voices and the clink of coffee cups. Ruth, the leader, greeted me with a hug, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're looking stronger every day," she said, and I felt a flush of pride. I'd started sharing more at the meetings, not just my pain, but my plans, my small victories. The other women, Helen, Sarah, and the others, listened with a fierce kind of love, their own stories weaving through mine. Helen, whose daughter had taken her savings, clapped me on the back when I told them about the will. "You're taking your life back," she said. "That's what they don't expect." Sarah, the retired teacher, slipped me a book on financial independence, her quiet smile saying more than words could. The group was planning a fundraiser for a local shelter, and Ruth asked if I'd help organize it. At first, I hesitated. I'd never been one for public roles, always content to stay in the background. But something in her eyes, in the way the others nodded, made me say yes. We spent the afternoon folding flyers and planning a bake sale, and for the first time in months, I felt useful, needed. I brought my peach cobbler recipe to the next meeting, and when the women raved about it, I felt a spark of the old Eleanor, the one who'd loved feeding people, making them smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Back at Margaret's, I kept meeting with Susan, refining the will and exploring my options for the house. She'd pulled more records on the coffee shop, and the news wasn't good. David and Claire were behind on payments, and the bank had sent a warning letter addressed to me since I'd co-signed the loan. I sat in Susan's office, the letter in my hands, and felt a mix of anger and fear. My credit, my future, was tangled up in their recklessness. "You could call in the loan," Susan said, her voice calm but firm. "Or you could use this as leverage. Let them know you're watching." The idea of confronting them made my heart race, but I was tired of being invisible. I told Susan to draft a letter to David and Claire, not calling in the loan yet, but reminding them of my role in the business and the consequences of defaulting. "Make it formal," I said. "I want them to feel it." When I got back to Margaret's, I wrote about the letter in my notebook, the words spilling out like a confession. I wrote about the fundraiser, the women's group, the way Helen's laugh made me feel less alone. I wrote about Tom, how he'd always said I was the backbone of our family, and how I was starting to believe him again. I wrote about the locket, the ring, the blue dress, small things that anchored me to the woman I was becoming. And I wrote about the house, my house, the one I'd built with Tom, the one I wasn't ready to let go of. The act of writing was like planting seeds, each word a step toward reclaiming my life. One evening, as I helped Margaret in her garden, she handed me a small pot with a single rose cutting. "It's from your garden," she said, her voice soft. "I went by your house a while back when you were still in the motel. I couldn't let them ruin everything." I stared at the cutting my throat tight. It was a piece of my roses, the ones I'd planted with Tom, the ones I'd thought were lost. I took the pot, my hands trembling, and planted it in Margaret's garden, pressing the soil around it with care. "It'll bloom next spring," Margaret said, and I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. That rose was more than a plant. It was a piece of me, a reminder that I could still take root even in new soil. The fundraiser was a week later, and I threw myself into it baking cobblers and helping set up tables at the community center. The day was bright, the air filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. I wore my blue dress, the locket gleaming at my throat, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The women's group worked as a team, Ruth directing us with her easy authority, Helen cracking jokes that made everyone laugh. We raised more money than we'd hoped, and when Ruth announced it to the crowd, she called me up to the front. "Eleanor's cobbler was the star of the show," she said, and the applause warmed me like sunlight. I looked out at the faces, strangers, friends, women like me, and felt a quiet pride. I wasn't just David's mother or Tom's widow. I was Eleanor, and I was enough. That night, I got a call from Susan. The letter had been sent to David and Claire, and she'd included a copy for me. I read it at Margaret's kitchen table, my hands steady. It was polite but firm, outlining my role as co-signer, the missed payments, and the potential consequences. It didn't threaten, but it didn't need to. The truth was enough. I imagined David reading it, his jaw tightening, Claire's eyes narrowing. Part of me wanted to call them to explain, to soften the blow, but I didn't. I'd spent too long apologizing for my existence. Instead, I wrote in my notebook describing the fundraiser, the rose cutting, the letter. I wrote about the women's group, how they'd become my family in a way David never could. And I wrote about myself, how I was starting to see my own strength, not through anyone else's eyes, but my own. The next day, I went to the antique shop again, drawn by a need I couldn't name. I wandered the aisles, my fingers brushing over old books and tarnished silver, until I saw a small wooden box carved with flowers. It was simple, but it reminded me of the jewelry box Tom had given me years ago. I bought it thinking I'd use it to hold my notebook or maybe letters I'd never send. When I showed it to Margaret, she nodded like she understood. "You're building something new, Eleanor," she said, piece by piece. I started carrying the box with me, a quiet symbol of the life I was creating. I filled it with small things, a pressed flower from Margaret's garden, a note from Ruth, a receipt from the fundraiser. Each item was a marker, a reminder that I was moving forward. I kept meeting with Susan, discussing the house and the business. She suggested I sell a small piece of land Tom and I had owned, a vacant lot we'd bought years ago as an investment. It's not much, she said, but it could give you some breathing room. I agreed, and when the sale went through, I felt a rush of power. The money wasn't life-changing, but it was mine, earned on my terms. One Sunday, as I walked to church with Margaret, I stopped at the cemetery where Tom was buried. I hadn't been there since the hospital, too raw to face him. But that day, I felt ready. I knelt by his grave, the grass cool under my knees, and touched the headstone. "I'm finding my way, Tom," I said. "I'm not the same, but I'm still here." I left a single tulip from Margaret's garden, its petals bright against the stone. As I walked away, the locket heavy against my chest, I felt lighter, like I'd left some of my grief behind. Back at Margaret's, I opened the wooden box and added the tulip stem, a quiet offering to the life I was building. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I was ready for it. David and Claire might think they'd won, but they didn't know the woman I was becoming. I closed the box, slipped Tom's ring onto my finger, and smiled. For the first time in months, it felt real. The autumn light had softened by the time I reached the 4th month at Margaret's, the days growing shorter, the air carrying a bite that made me pull my coat tighter. I was 68 years old, and though the scar on my chest had faded to a faint line, the deeper wound, David's betrayal. Claire's dismissal still throbbed in quiet moments. But I was changing, not just surviving, but growing like the rose. Cutting Margaret had saved from my garden, now taking root in her soil. I could feel it in the way I carried myself, in the steady rhythm of my steps as I walked to the community center, in the way my voice no longer trembled when I spoke of my plans. I was Eleanor, and I was learning to claim that name for myself. Margaret's house was still my sanctuary, its walls holding the warmth of our late-night talks and the smell of her baking. She'd taken to calling me trouble with a wink, teasing me about the fire she saw in my eyes. "You're not the same woman who showed up here," she said one morning, handing me a mug of coffee. "You're up to something, and I can't wait to see it." I smiled, sipping the coffee, and thought of the wooden box on my nightstand, filled with small tokens of my new life. The pressed tulip, the fundraiser receipt, a note from Ruth. Each one was a step, a piece of the foundation I was building. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew it was mine. The women's group had become my lifeline. Every Tuesday, I'd walk to the community center, the blue dress swishing around my knees, the locket with Tom's photo resting against my heart. The other women, Ruth, Helen, Sarah, greeted me like family, their hugs fierce and their laughter a balm. We'd sit in a circle sharing stories of resilience, of rebuilding after loss. I'd started speaking up more, not just about the pain of David's rejection, but about the strength I was finding. One day, I told them about the letter Susan had sent to David and Claire, the one reminding them I'd co-signed their loan. Helen let out a whoop, her eyes gleaming. "You're playing chess, Eleanor," she said. "They don't even know they're on the board." Ruth nodded, her smile quiet but proud. "You're not just taking back your power," she said. "You're showing them who you've always been." The fundraiser had sparked something in me, a desire to do more than just exist. Ruth asked me to help plan a winter event for the shelter, a holiday market with crafts and baked goods. I threw myself into it, spending evenings at Margaret's kitchen table, sketching ideas for table displays and baking batches of my peach cobbler to test. Margaret would taste them, declaring each one better than the last, even when I knew the crust was too dry. The work gave me purpose, a reason to get up each morning. I started sewing again, something I hadn't done since David was a boy. I'd found an old sewing machine in Margaret's attic, and with her encouragement, I began making simple table runners for the market. The hum of the machine, the feel of fabric under my fingers, brought back memories of making curtains with Tom, of building a home stitch by stitch. It wasn't just crafting, it was reclaiming a piece of myself. My meetings with Susan the lawyer were becoming more focused. The sale of the vacant lot had given me a small cushion enough to breathe easier, but the coffee shop was still a problem. David and Claire had responded to Susan's letter with a curt email promising to catch up on payments, but Susan's latest check showed they'd missed another one. "They're digging themselves deeper," she said, her voice calm but pointed. "You need to decide how far you're willing to let this go." I sat in her office, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Calling in the loan would ruin them, maybe even force them to close the shop. Part of me still loved David, still saw the boy who'd clung to me when Tom died. But another part, the part that had woken up alone in the hospital, knew I couldn't keep saving him at my own expense. "Give them one more chance," I said, "but start preparing for what comes next." Susan nodded, and I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. I was done being their safety net. That night, I wrote in my notebook, the wooden box open beside me. I wrote about the market, the table runners, the way Ruth's praise had made me stand taller. I wrote about Susan, the missed payments, the choice I'd made to protect myself. And I wrote about Tom, how he'd always said I was the strongest person he knew. I doubted it then, but now with every step I took, I was starting to believe him. I closed the notebook and added a new token to the box, a scrap of fabric from the table runner's blue like my dress. It was small, but it felt like a victory, a reminder that I could still create something beautiful. One afternoon, I went to the library again, diving deeper into property law and estate planning. The librarian Mary had become a quiet ally, pointing me to books and even printing articles for me. I'd started keeping a folder organizing everything I learned about my rights as the homeowner, my options for the business. It was tedious work, but it gave me a sense of control, like I was arming myself for a battle I wasn't ready to fight. On my way out, I passed a small park where children were playing, their laughter sharp and bright. I stopped watching a mother push her daughter on a swing and felt a pang for David, for the boy he'd been. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if he regretted what he'd done. The thought hurt, but I let it pass like a cloud moving across the sky. I couldn't change him, but I could change me. Back at Margaret's, I started taking longer walks, my body stronger now, my steps surer. I'd pass houses with gardens, noting the flowers, the way they were tended or neglected. It made me think of my own garden, the roses I'd left behind. One day, on impulse, I asked Margaret to drive me by the house. I didn't want to go inside just to see it. As we pulled up, my heart sank. The porch was cluttered with boxes, the lawn overgrown, and my roses, my pride, were wilted, their petals scattered on the ground. I sat in the car, my hands clenched, and felt a surge of anger. This was my home, my life, and they were letting it decay. Margaret touched my arm. "You'll take it back," she said, "one way or another." I nodded, tears burning my eyes, and made a silent vow. I wouldn't let them destroy everything I'd built. That evening, I sewed a new table runner, pouring my anger into every stitch. The fabric was red, bold, and fierce, like the woman I was becoming. When I showed it to Margaret, she clapped her hands. "That's not just a table runner," she said. "That's a declaration." I laughed, the sound surprising me, and felt a lightness I hadn't known in months. I was still hurting, still afraid, but I was also alive, more alive than I'd been in years. I added a scrap of the red fabric to my wooden box, another marker of my journey. The holiday market was a week away, and I poured myself into the preparations, baking and sewing late into the night. The women's group was buzzing with excitement, and I felt a pride I hadn't expected. I was part of something, not just a shadow in someone else's story. Ruth asked me to give a short speech at the market to thank the volunteers and donors. The idea terrified me. I'd never spoken in front of a crowd, but I said yes, knowing it was another step toward reclaiming my voice. I practiced in Margaret's living room, my words halting at first, then stronger. "You sound like a woman who knows her worth," Margaret said, and I believed her. The day of the market was cold but bright. The community center transformed with lights and tables piled high with crafts. I wore my blue dress, the locket, and Tom's ring, my quiet talismans. My table runners sold out within hours, and my cobbler was gone before noon. When Ruth called me to the front for my speech, my knees shook, but I looked out at the crowd. Helen, Sarah, Margaret, strangers who'd become friends and found my voice. "This market isn't just about raising money," I said. "It's about building something together, about showing up for each other when the world feels heavy. Thank you for showing up for me." The applause was warm, and as I stepped down, Ruth hugged me, whispering, "You're a force, Eleanor." That night, I got a call from David. His voice was tense, different from before. "Mom," he said, "we got your lawyer's letter. What are you trying to do?" I took a deep breath, my hand resting on the wooden box. "I'm protecting what's mine, David," I said. "You should do the same." He started to argue, but I cut him off. "We'll talk when you're ready to listen." I hung up, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. Margaret, who'd overheard, raised her coffee mug in a toast. "To Eleanor," she said, "the woman who doesn't back down." I wrote about it all in my notebook, the market, the speech David's called the Red Table Runner. I wrote about the roses, how I'd take them back just like I was taking back my life. And I wrote about Tom, how I felt him with me, not just in the locket, but in the strength I was finding. I closed the notebook, added a pebble from the community center's parking lot to my box, and looked at my reflection in the window. The woman staring back wasn't whole yet, but she was fierce, and she was mine. The winter had crept in by the time I marked 5 months at Margaret's, the air sharp with frost, the oak trees outside her bungalow stripped bare. I was 68, and though the physical scars of my surgery had softened into a faint line, the emotional ones, David's rejection, Claire's coldness still pulsed beneath the surface, less raw but ever present. Yet I was no longer the woman who'd stumbled into that motel, broken and lost. I was Eleanor, and with every choice, every small act, I was stitching myself back together. The wooden box on my nightstand held the proof, a scrap of red fabric, a pressed tulip, a pebble from the holiday market. Each was a marker of my journey, a testament to the life I was building, not for David or Claire, but for me. Mornings at Margaret's had become a ritual. I'd wake to the smell of coffee, slip Tom's ring onto my finger, and touch the locket with his photo, feeling him close. Margaret would be in the kitchen humming as she cooked her gray hair, catching the light. "You're looking dangerous today," she'd say, teasing me about the determination in my eyes. I'd laugh, but I felt it too, a quiet fire growing stronger. Over breakfast, we'd talk about my plans, my meetings with Susan, the women's group. Margaret was my anchor, her belief in me unwavering. "You're not just surviving Eleanor," she said one morning, "sliding a plate of pancakes my way. You're rewriting your story." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that I was the author now, not a character in someone else's tale. The women's group was my second home. Every Tuesday, I'd walk to the community center, the locket warm against my chest, my blue dress a quiet declaration of who I was becoming. Ruth, Helen, and Sarah welcomed me with hugs, their stories and laughter weaving a net that caught me when I faltered. The holiday market had been a triumph, and my speech, halting but honest, had left me feeling taller, stronger. Ruth had started calling me our secret weapon, joking that my cobbler could solve world peace. But it was more than the baking or the table runners I'd sewn. It was the way they saw me not as a discarded mother or a widow, but as Eleanor, a woman with something to give. They'd asked me to lead a workshop on sewing for the next event, and though the idea made my stomach flutter, I said yes. I was done hiding. My meetings with Susan were sharpening my resolve. The coffee shop was still a mess. David and Claire had made one payment after Susan's letter, but Susan's latest check showed they'd missed another. My credit, my future, was tied to their recklessness, and I was done letting it slide. Susan laid out my options in her cluttered office, her voice steady. "You could call in the loan now," she said. "It would force them to sell the shop or find a new lender, but it would protect your credit. Or you could wait. Let them think they're in control and use the house as leverage." The house? My house, the one I'd built with Tom, the one they were neglecting. I'd seen it that day with Margaret. The roses wilted the lawn, a tangle of weeds. The memory stung, but it also fueled me. "Start the paperwork to call in the loan," I said, "but don't send it yet. I want to be ready." Susan nodded, a glint of respect in her eyes. "You're playing this smart, Eleanor," she said. "They won't see you coming." That night, I sat at Margaret's kitchen table, my notebook open, the wooden box beside me. I wrote about Susan's advice, the missed payments, the power I held. I wrote about the women's group, how Helen's sharp wit and Ruth's quiet strength made me feel like I belonged. I wrote about the sewing workshop, how I was nervous but excited to teach, to share something I loved. And I wrote about Tom, how I felt him in the locket, in the ring, in the courage I was finding. I added a new token to the box, a needle from my sewing kit, small but sharp like the woman I was becoming. As I closed the box, I felt a shift, like the ground beneath me was steadying. I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was reshaping it. One morning, I decided to visit my garden again, not just to look, but to act. I asked Margaret to drive me, and this time I brought a pair of shears and a small pot. When we pulled up, the house looked worse. Paint peeling the porch, sagging under more boxes. My roses were barely clinging to life, their stems brittle. I stepped out of the car, my heart pounding, and walked to the garden. Margaret stayed by the car, watching like a sentinel. I knelt in the dirt, my hands trembling, and carefully clipped a few stems, whispering to the roses like they could hear me. "I'm not leaving you," I said. I took the cuttings and a handful of soil, placing them in the pot. As I stood, I saw Claire at the window, her face a mix of surprise and irritation. I met her eyes, held her gaze, and turned away. I didn't owe her an explanation. This was my home, my garden, my life. Back at Margaret's, I planted the rose cuttings in her garden next to the one she'd saved months ago. I worked slowly, mixing the soil from my house with hers, feeling the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't just about roses. It was about carrying my past into my future, refusing to let David and Claire erase me. Margaret watched, her eyes soft. "You're taking back what's yours," she said. I nodded, my throat tight. "Piece by piece," I said. That night, I wrote about the roses, the look on Claire's face, the soil under my nails. I wrote about the house, how I'd fight for it, not out of anger, but because it was mine. And I wrote about myself, how I was starting to see my own worth, not through David's eyes or Claire's dismissal, but through my own. The sewing workshop was a week later, and I spent days preparing cutting fabric and practicing my instructions. The community center was warm, the room filled with women from the group and a few new faces. I stood at the front, my hands steady, and explained how to make a simple tote bag. My voice wavered at first, but as I showed them how to thread the needle, how to stitch a straight line, I found my rhythm. The women listened, their faces attentive, and when they started sewing, the room buzzed with quiet focus. Helen, who claimed she couldn't sew to save her life, made a lopsided bag and held it up like a trophy. "You're a miracle worker, Eleanor," she said, and everyone laughed. I felt a warmth spread through me, a pride I hadn't known I could still feel. I was teaching, creating, connecting. I was alive. After the workshop, Ruth pulled me aside. "You've got a gift," she said. "Not just for sewing, but for bringing people together. Don't stop." Her words stayed with me, a spark that grew into an idea. I started thinking about a small business, maybe selling my table runners and bags at local markets. It was a dream, small but mine, and it felt possible. I talked it over with Margaret, who clapped her hands like I'd announced I was running for president. "You're going to take over the world, Eleanor," she said. I laughed, but I felt the possibility like a seed waiting to bloom. Susan called a few days later with news. The paperwork to call in the loan was ready, and she drafted a lease agreement for the house, one that would make David and Claire tenants, not owners. "If you sign this," she said, "they'll have to pay rent or leave. It's your call." I sat with the papers, my heart racing. This was real, a line I couldn't uncross. I thought of David, the boy who'd once drawn me pictures, and Claire, who'd once called me Mom. But I also thought of the hospital, the motel, the roses dying in my garden. "Send the lease," I said, "and prepare to call in the loan if they don't sign." Susan's voice was warm. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor." That night, I went to the cemetery, something I'd started doing more often. I knelt by Tom's grave, the grass brittle with frost, and touched the headstone. "I'm fighting, Tom," I said. "Not the way you'd expect, but I'm fighting." I left a rose petal from the cuttings, its red vivid against the stone. As I walked away, the locket heavy against my chest, I felt him with me, not just in memory, but in the strength I was building. I was ready for what came next, not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. Back at Margaret's, I opened my wooden box and added a new token, a copy of the lease agreement folded small. It wasn't just paper, it was power proof that I was taking back what was mine. I wrote in my notebook, filling pages with the workshop, the rose cuttings, Susan's call. I wrote about the business idea, the women's group, the way Ruth's words had made me dream again. And I wrote about myself, how I was no longer just surviving, but thriving one deliberate step at a time. I closed the notebook, looked at my reflection in the window, and saw a woman who was ready not for revenge, but for justice, for the life she deserved. The winter had deepened the frost, now lacing Margaret's windows, each morning turning the world outside into a delicate, brittle thing. I was 68, and 6 months had passed since I'd woken up alone in that hospital bed, the silence louder than the machines keeping me alive. The scar on my chest was barely visible now, a faint whisper of the cancer I'd survived. But the deeper wound, David's betrayal. Claire's calculated cruelty still lingered, though it no longer ruled me. I was Eleanor, and I was no longer the woman who'd packed a suitcase and left her home in defeat. I was a woman with a plan, a purpose, and a power my son and daughter-in-law hadn't seen coming. The wooden box on my nightstand held the evidence, a needle, a rose petal, a folded lease agreement, small tokens of a life I was reclaiming step by quiet step. Mornings at Margaret's were my anchor. I'd wake to the scent of her coffee, slip Tom's ring onto my finger, and press the locket with his photo against my heart. Margaret would be in the kitchen, her gray hair catching the light, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "You're up to no good, I can tell," she'd say, sliding a plate of toast my way. I'd smile, feeling the truth of it. The fire in me was growing, fueled by the women's group, my meetings with Susan, and the small victories I was stacking like stones in a wall. "I'm just getting started," I'd reply, and her laugh would fill the room warm as the sunlight slanting through the window. The women's group was my second family now. Every Tuesday, I'd walk to the community center, the cold biting my cheeks, my blue dress hidden under a wool coat, but still a quiet declaration of who I was. Ruth, Helen, and Sarah would greet me with hugs, their voices a chorus of strength and survival. The sewing workshop had been a success, and the women were already planning a spring event, asking me to lead another. I'd started selling my table runners at a local craft fair, just a few at first, but the sight of strangers buying something I'd made with my hands filled me with a pride I hadn't known I could still feel. Helen Ever the comedian called me the table runner tycoon, and Ruth slipped me a list of local markets, her smile saying she believed in me. I was building something, not just a business, but a life, and it felt like a gift I was giving myself. My meetings with Susan were the steel in my spine. The lease agreement for the house had been sent to David and Claire, and Susan had warned me they'd have 30 days to sign or face eviction. The coffee shop loan was another matter. They'd made one more payment, but Susan's latest check showed they were still behind my credit, hanging in the balance. If they don't sign the lease, Susan said, her voice calm but firm, you can move to evict. If they default on the loan, you can call it in. Either way, you're in control. I sat in her office, the weight of her words settling over me. Control. I'd spent so long giving it away to David, to Claire, to the idea of family. Now I was taking it back. Set a court date, I said. If they don't sign, I want to be ready. Susan nodded her pen, moving across her notepad. You're doing this right, Eleanor, she said. They won't know what hit them. That night, I sat at Margaret's kitchen table. The wooden box opened, my notebook in front of me. I wrote about Susan's words, the lease, the court date. I wrote about the craft fair, the way a woman had bought my red table runner and said it reminded her of her mother. I wrote about the women's group, how Sarah had shared a poem about resilience that made us all cry. And I wrote about Tom, how I felt him in the locket, in the ring, and the courage I was finding. I added a new token to the box, a receipt from the craft fair, proof that I was creating something new. As I closed the box, I felt a quiet certainty. I was ready for what came next, not with anger, but with the dignity they'd tried to strip away. A week later, I got a call from David. His voice was tight, almost desperate. Mom, he said, what's this lease nonsense? You can't be serious. I took a deep breath, my hand resting on the locket. I'm very serious, David, I said. That house is mine. You and Claire can pay rent or leave. He sputtered, his voice rising. This is our home, Mom. You're being unreasonable. I closed my eyes, picturing the boy who'd once run to me and said, You made your choice when you told me to leave. Now I'm making mine. I hung up before he could argue, my heart pounding, but my resolve unshaken. Margaret, who'd been listening, raised her mug in a toast. That's my Eleanor, she said. They're learning who you are. The court date was set for a month later, and I spent the weeks preparing, not just with Susan, but in my own way. I went to the cemetery, kneeling by Tom's grave, the frost crunching under my knees. I'm doing this for us, I said, leaving a rose petal from the cuttings I'd saved. I sewed more table runners, each stitch, a declaration of my strength. I led another workshop at the community center, teaching women to make aprons, their laughter filling the room like music. And I wrote, filling my notebook with every step, every fear, every hope. I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving, and it felt like a rebellion against everyone who'd tried to make me small. The day of the court hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of day that makes you want to stay inside. But I was ready. I wore my blue dress, the locket, and Tom's ring, my quiet armor. Margaret drove me to the courthouse, her hand squeezing mine as we parked. You've got this, she said. Show them who you are. I nodded, my heart steady, and walked inside. The courtroom was small, the air thick with tension. David and Claire were already there, sitting with a lawyer who looked too young for his suit. David wouldn't meet my eyes, but Claire's gaze was sharp, her lips pressed into a thin line. I sat beside Susan, my hands folded, and felt a calm I hadn't expected. The judge, a woman with gray hair and a no-nonsense voice, called the case. Susan stood presenting the facts with a clarity that cut through the room. She explained that the house was in my name, that I'd co-signed the loan for the coffee shop, that David and Claire had been given 30 days to sign the lease and had refused. She presented the missed payments, the threat to my credit, and my right to protect my assets. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. David's lawyer argued, claiming I'd given them permission to live in the house, that the lease was unfair. But Susan was prepared, her evidence, airtight deeds loan documents, even the text messages David had sent me, dismissing me from my own home. When it was my turn to speak, I stood my knees trembling, but my voice steady. Your Honor, I said this house is more than property. It's the life I built with my husband, the home I raised my son in. I gave everything to my family, and when I needed them when I was in the hospital fighting cancer, they told me to leave. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to protect what's mine, to live with the dignity I deserve. I looked at David, then his face pale, and Claire, her eyes wide. The room was quiet, the judge's pen scratching the only sound. I sat down, my heart racing, but I felt Tom with me, his strength in my veins. The judge didn't take long. She ruled in my favor, ordering David and Claire to sign the lease or vacate within 30 days. She also gave me the right to call in the loan if they missed another payment, a power I hadn't fully realized I held. As she spoke, I saw David's shoulders slump, Claire's hand gripping his arm. They hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me. Susan touched my hand, her smile small but triumphant. You did it, Eleanor, she whispered. I nodded, tears prickling my eyes, not from sadness but from pride. I'd stood up not with shouting or vengeance, but with the quiet strength of a woman who knew her worth. Outside the courtroom, David approached me, his face a mix of anger and shame. Mom, he said, why are you doing this? I looked at him, searching for the boy I'd raised, and said, because I deserve better, David. And so do you. Claire stood behind him, silent for once, her eyes avoiding mine. I turned away, Margaret at my side, and walked into the cold air. The weight of their betrayal was still there, but it was lighter now, overshadowed by the power I'd claimed. I wasn't just Eleanor, the discarded mother. I was Eleanor, the woman who'd faced her family, and won not for revenge, but for justice. That night, I sat at Margaret's table, the wooden box open, my notebook in front of me. I wrote about the courtroom, the judge's voice, the look on David's face. I wrote about Susan, the women's group, the table runners I'd sell at the next market. And I wrote about Tom, how I'd felt him with me, guiding me through. I added a new token to the box, a copy of the court order folded small. It wasn't just paper, it was proof that I'd stood my ground. I closed the box, looked at my reflection in the window, and saw a woman who was whole, not because of anyone else, but because of herself. The winter had settled into a quiet rhythm. By the time I reached the 7th month at Margaret's, the frost giving way to the first hints of spring, a softness in the air that promised new beginnings. I was 68, and the journey from that lonely hospital bed to now felt like a lifetime. The scar on my chest was a faint memory, but the deeper wounds, David's betrayal, Claire's dismissal, had transformed no longer a raw ache, but a quiet reminder of what I'd overcome. I was Eleanor, and I had built a life from the ashes of their rejection, not with anger, but with a dignity that felt like a gift to myself. The wooden box on my nightstand held the proof, a needle, a rose petal, a court order, small tokens of a woman who'd refused to be erased. Mornings at Margaret's were still my anchor. I'd wake to the scent of her coffee, slip Tom's ring onto my finger, and touch the locket with his photo, feeling him close. Margaret would be in the kitchen, her gray hair catching the early light, a teasing smile on her lips. You're glowing, Eleanor, she said one morning, handing me a mug, like you've got the world in your pocket. I laughed the sound easier now and felt the truth of it. The court victory had shifted something in me, not just power over the house and the business, but a deeper certainty. I wasn't just surviving, I was whole, and that was a triumph no one could take away. The women's group remained my second family. Every Tuesday I'd walk to the community center, the locket warm against my chest, my blue dress a quiet symbol of my strength. Ruth, Helen, and Sarah greeted me with hugs, their voices a chorus of pride after the court hearing. You showed them. Helen said, her eyes gleaming. They thought they could push you out, but you're a force." Ruth pulled me aside, her smile soft. "You've inspired us, Eleanor," she said, "not just to fight, but to live." Their words wrapped around me like a quilt, warm and steady. I was leading another workshop soon, this time on making quilts, and I'd started selling my table runners and tote bags at more local markets. Each sale, each smile from a customer felt like a brick in the foundation of my new life. The court ruling had changed everything. David and Claire had signed the lease, their signatures, grudging but binding. They were tenants now paying rent to live in my house, a fact that must have stung. Susan had warned me they were scrambling to keep the coffee shop afloat, but they'd made the last 2 payments barely. "They're on thin ice," she said during our latest meeting. "One more missed payment and you can call in the loan." I nodded, my hands steady. I didn't want to destroy them, but I was done carrying their weight. The house was mine, the business tied to my name, and I held the power to decide what came next. Susan suggested I consider selling the house not to David and Claire, but on my terms to start fresh. The idea sat with me heavy, but not unwelcome. I wasn't ready to decide, but I was open to the possibility, a sign of how far I'd come. Back at Margaret's, I threw myself into the small acts that grounded me. I tended the rose cuttings in her garden, watching them grow stronger, their roots deep in the soil I'd brought from my house. I sewed late into the night, my quilts taking shape under the hum of the machine, each stitch a piece of my story. I cooked with Margaret, laughing as we burned a batch of cookies, the kitchen filled with smoke and our shared joy. And I wrote my notebook, nearly full now, its pages, a map of my journey. I wrote about the court, the lease, the women's group. I wrote about the roses, how they were blooming again just like me. And I wrote about Tom, how I carried him with me, not as a weight, but as a light. One afternoon I went to the cemetery, the grass soft under my feet, the air warm with spring's promise. I knelt by Tom's grave, touching the headstone, the rose petal I'd left months ago, long gone. "I did it, Tom," I said. "I fought for us, for me." I left a new petal, its red bright against the stone, and felt a peace settle over me. I wasn't just honoring him, I was honoring myself, the woman he'd always believed in. As I walked away, the locket heavy against my chest, I knew I was at peace, not because of what I'd won, but because of who I'd become. The spring event at the community center was a week later, and I poured myself into it, leading the quilt workshop and selling my crafts at a booth. The room was alive with color and laughter, the women's group working as a team, Ruth directing with her quiet authority, Helen cracking jokes. My quilts were a hit, and when a young woman bought one, saying it reminded her of her grandmother, I felt tears prick my eyes. I wasn't just selling fabric, I was sharing my heart, my resilience. Ruth asked me to speak again, a short thank you to the volunteers. I stood at the front, my voice steady now, and said, "This isn't just about quilts or money. It's about building something new, about finding your worth when the world tries to take it away. Thank you for helping me find mine." The applause was warm, and as I stepped down, Sarah hugged me, whispering, "You're our hero, Eleanor." That night I got a letter from David, the first since the court hearing. It was shorthand written, his scrawl familiar but distant. "Mom," it read, "I'm sorry for how things turned out. We're trying to make it right. Can we talk?" I sat at Margaret's table, the letter in my hands, and felt a mix of emotions, grief for the boy he'd been, anger for what he'd done, and a quiet strength that didn't need his apology. I didn't call him, didn't write back. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but I was at peace with that choice. I folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box, not as a token of reconciliation, but as a reminder of my own boundaries. Margaret, watching, nodded. "You're living for you now," she said. "That's what matters." I started planning my next steps, not just for the house or the business, but for my life. I met with a real estate agent, not to sell the house yet, but to understand its value, to know my options. I expanded my craft business, renting a small stall at a weekly market, my table runners and quilts drawing a steady stream of customers. I joined a book club with Sarah, losing myself in stories of women who rebuilt their lives. And I kept writing, starting a new notebook when the old one filled each word a step toward wholeness. I was dreaming again, not of the past, but of a future I could shape. One morning, I went to Margaret's garden and saw the first rose bloom, its petals red and vibrant, a piece of my old life thriving in the new. I knelt beside it, my hands in the soil, and felt a surge of gratitude. For Margaret, for the women's group, for Tom, for myself. I clipped a single rose and took it to the community center, placing it in a vase at the front of the room where we met. For new beginnings, I said when Ruth asked, and she smiled understanding. That evening, I lit a candle in Margaret's living room, its flame small but steady, and made a quiet vow. I would live with grace, with purpose, with the dignity I'd fought for. As I sat at the table, the wooden box open, I added one final token, a petal from the rose, its color vivid against the other mementos. I looked at my reflection in the window, the woman staring back, strong and whole. I thought of David, of Claire, of the house I might one day sell or reclaim. I thought of the hospital, the motel, the courtroom, and how far I'd come. And I thought of you, the ones watching this, the ones who know what it's like to be unseen, to be discarded. I want you to know something it took me 68 years to learn your worth, isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. I closed the box, blew out the candle, and smiled. The rose in Margaret's garden would bloom again, and so would I.